Hi, everybody. This is SAAD TRUTH. Today I have a fantastic guest, someone who I've been a fan of for a long time. I read this book of his last summer in Southern California with my family, and I had planned on contacting him back then. But now that he is an infectious disease specialist and we've got this global pandemic going, there's even more reason to speak to Dr. Paul Offit. How you doing, Paul?
I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you for being on the show. So I wanted to just spend maybe a minute giving a sense to people of who you are. So you are the Morris R. Hillman Professor of Vaccinology and Professor of Pediatrics at the Medical School at the University of Pennsylvania. You're also the former Chief of Division of Infectious Diseases and the Director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. You are the co-inventor of a rotavirus, I think, that is responsible for a lot of diarrhea problems in children, causes all kinds of havoc in young kids. Author of well over 100 books and articles and many books, of which I'll only list a few, some of which we'll talk about today. So the most recent one is, again, this one, Bad Advice, or Why Celebrities, Politicians, and Activists Aren't Your Best Source of Health Information. Bad Faith, When Religious Belief Undermines Modern Medicine, which we might want to talk about because it is certainly spreading in some religious communities. I'm talking about the coronavirus. Do You Believe in Magic? The Sense and Nonsense of Alternative Medicine. I'm not sure if Andrew Weil is going to be happy with you. Deadly Choices, How the Anti-Vaccine Movement Threatens Us All. And then Autism's False Prophets, Bad Science, Risky Medicine, and The Search for a Cure. Well, it's too bad that you haven't been very busy, Paul. You should try to be more of a go-getter. So I don't know how you want to do this. We should start with the current events, the coronavirus, and then we can go into the other stuff. Can you contextualize for us where you think we are in this mess?
I think we're getting better. I think we're actually starting to flatten the curve. If you look, if you count sort of deaths from COVID-19, and then use the Angela Merkel rule, which I use because I see her as the leader of the free world. She said, get us to a 10-day doubling period for either hospitalizations from COVID-19 or deaths from COVID-19. And then I think we will be able to comfortably say that hospital discharges will be greater than hospital admissions. I think that's right. We had 1,000 deaths on March 26th. We had 2,000 by the 28th. That's a doubling time of 2 days, which is ridiculously fast. We went from 2,000 to 4,000 in about 4 days. We went from 4,000 to 8,500 also in 4 days. It looks like we're going to go to from 8,500 to 17,000 probably by tomorrow, which will be a 5-day doubling period. I mean, Germany's right now at about a 6-day doubling period. Italy's at about an 8-day doubling period. They're well past their curve, and so I think we're on the right track. I think we were just, what you're looking at now is what happened 3 weeks ago, and I think we've been slow to really, shelter in place or lockdown throughout the country. It's been kind of sporadic, so we're seeing these sort of, wave after wave after wave. But I think we're getting there. I think we'll get on top of this. I mean, March 2nd, I was on CNN's Christiane Amanpour program, and I said I didn't think we would have the number of deaths here that we had from epidemic flu every year. And I still think that's going to be true. So we'll see.
Now, when one achieves the flattening of the curve, are there general epidemiological rules that say, well, the minute that or the day that that you flatten the curve, here is the amount of time that you still have to be in some isolation so that you don't get a second wave? Are there these types of mathematical models that can kind of lead us out of sort of blind decision making?
It's no. I think it's the short answer. I think it's because there's so many variables to take in place that are still unknowns. I mean, is this virus going to, or transmission of the virus going to be affected by hotter or more humid climate? Don't know. I mean, we'll see. To what extent is it transmitted in a susceptible population in a rural community versus a more densely populated community? Still unclear. So I think we don't know. But I think the goal is not to prevent all COVID hospitalizations and all COVID deaths. There will be a second round. I think as we go back to work, there will be a second round. The goal is not to overwhelm the healthcare system. I mean, if we want to prevent COVID hospitalizations and deaths, stay inside for the next 2 years. And I think that's probably the best way to do it. But, there is a second round of public health disaster that's on the way. I mean, we already have roughly 15 million Americans who are out of work. I think that number could easily get to 35 million Americans who are out of work. With that level of joblessness comes homelessness and all the attendant medical consequences of homelessness, food insecurity and domestic violence and child abuse and and depression and suicide and other healthcare related issues. So that's round two. It's going to be much longer lasting, I think. But so there's no perfect balance. I think we do as soon as we can need to get back to work so that people can be employed, so they can pay their bills, or else they're all going to be really in trouble. And so there's no perfect solution. There's a balance, and I don't think we struck it.
Well, I was actually, you kind of preempted one of the questions I had for later in our conversation, where I heard you on a recent podcast where you were basically arguing, and you'll correct me if I'm overstating what you said, that you're saying, well, look, I think there's been a bit of an overreaction in that we are not looking at the downstream effects that you just mentioned, the suicides due to loss of unemployment, the anxiety, the depression, the increased marital strife that might happen, the child abuse that might happen. Do you get this? Is this true? Are you one of the lone voices in the wilderness that is talking about these downstream effects? And if that's so, why aren't other public health officials taking up the mantle?
I think politically, for a public health official to say, look, we need to get back to work as soon as we can, it sounds like you don't care, that you don't care about these people who are currently being hospitalized or dying from COVID. It sounds like you don't want to do everything you need to do that. And I think that's not true. I do think people are starting to talk a little bit about this. Certainly, we knew that there was, a couple of weeks ago, there was 3.3 million Americans that applied for unemployment insurance. Then the following week, 6.6 million. Now it's another 6 million. So you're already up over 50 million. And that's just for the people who can apply. I mean, there are a lot of people who are either immigrants and are not documented, or people who are working who can't apply for unemployment insurance. So I think you're seeing just a fraction of really what the real problem is. This is going to be a huge problem. And I just wish it was politically a little more correct to talk about it, because we're not really talking about it. But I do think people are starting to talk about it a little bit, but certainly very little in the media.
Now, earlier you mentioned, you didn't compare it explicitly, but say to the usual flu and so on. And a lot of people despise this comparison because it makes it seem as though you're not recognizing the unique characteristics of the current pandemic. So maybe we could talk a bit about the R naught, and the mortality rate, contextualize the current pandemic to historically other pandemics.
Right. So take a mild flu pandemic from 2009, 2010, a pandemic that historically was mild. Usually we have about 3 pandemics a year from flu. That pandemic, for which we had a vaccine. We had a vaccine in advance of that pandemic. There were a little over 200,000 deaths worldwide, and in the U.S., about 12,500 deaths from that virus alone, although there were other flu viruses that circulated that also caused deaths. Typically, you'll have about anywhere from 30 to 60,000 deaths from flu a year. There was a little more that year because of that.
In the U.S. or globally, you're saying?
So U.S.
Oh, yes, okay.
U.S. is 30, 40,000 deaths a year. Globally, it's actually hundreds of thousands of deaths. No, I just was, what I was trying to do, and I can't say I certainly got enough hate mail for it after I did it, but I was just trying to, say, life is risk. I mean, let's put these risks in context of other risks. I mean, it's just as bad to die from influenza as it is to die from COVID-19. Dead is dead. I'm just trying to put this in a larger context.
The hate mail that you get usually is coming from, not too many other colleagues, I hope, but it's coming just from general people who are of a political bent, who then think that you are of the opposite political bent by espousing the positions that you're taking. What's causing the hate?
It was also coming from colleagues. From people who felt that I was not really paying enough attention to COVID-19, or I was just sort of dismissing it. That really wasn't true. I was just trying to argue that let's put it in some context. The incidence of influenza has also dramatically decreased associated with this, sheltering in place or lockdowns. If you wanted to stop the 30 or 40 or 50,000 deaths, and the upper limit estimate now from the CDC for deaths from influenza is 65,000 deaths this year, we could stop that by doing what we're doing now, shelter in place. Do that and you'll have far fewer flu deaths every year. But there's the price to pay for not leaving your home. And I argue it's the same thing here. So the difference between flu and this virus surged. Flu starts in October, and you sort of have it generally equally distributed October, November, December, January, February. So it's kind of spread out here. The virus didn't really come here or start with community spread till around January. So, and then there was just this massive increase. So that's why the hospitals got overwhelmed, whereas they're not overwhelmed with flu every year.
But the R naught, I know it's the final one hasn't been calculated yet. It keeps changing. But the current sort of best estimate of the R naught is somewhat higher than their usual flu. Is that correct?
Hard to know. I mean, it's still it's around 2. So there are not, a reproducibility index just means that if I'm infected, I'll infect 2 people during my normal day, and then they'll infect 2 more and 2 more. So the last I heard, it's still somewhat around that. The difference is, I think this virus also has a large fomite transmission, meaning hands, surfaces, ATM machines, handrails, etc. I think there's a big fomite component to this because it had that feel initially, right? Cruise ships, nursing homes, that sounds like norovirus. So I do think there may be a fecal oral component to this. Certainly there's a big fomite component to it. So we'll see.
I mean, something like, to contextualize compared to other viruses, something like some avian flus, I mean, they can have 60% mortality rate, but it's very hard to transmit from one person to another, correct?
Right, and that's a perfect example. Actually, the avian flu, the H5N1 that sort of raised its head in Southeast Asia, people were scared that was going to be a pandemic virus, but it really didn't reproduce itself very well in the upper respiratory tract, much better in the lower respiratory tract. So you needed very close contact, and you needed a large burden, which is why it never became a pandemic.
Right,
it wasn't transmitted easily enough.
Got it. I published a Psychology Today article a few days ago where I was talking about adaptive fears, right? So we come to the world with certain fears, some of which stay with us our whole lives. So 2 of the fears that I have, and I argue are perfectly adaptive from an evolutionary perspective as an evolutionary behavioral scientist, is my fear of mosquitoes, which makes perfect sense because you're much more likely to die from mosquitoes than from all other animals combined, number 1. And number 2, I'm a huge germaphobe. So from a very, very young age, I can't touch anything that other people have touched. So I wouldn't consider, if I'm going to diagnose myself, I'm not at the OCD level in that it's not a dysfunction. I don't spend 8 hours a day before going to work washing my hands, but I am terribly disdainful of anything dealing with germs. And so in a sense, my adaptive fears have inoculated me against this reality, perhaps, no?
Yeah, well, Tony Fauci recently said that maybe this is the end of shaking hands. So, you're going to be coming in vogue.
There you go. So my fist bumps, maybe I should take copyright credit for the fist bump. Maybe we'll be spreading like a virus. Now, let's go back. Earlier, you mentioned Angela Merkel. And I guess their mortality rate has been really low, like in the order of maybe 2,000-3,000, right? What explains... So the fact that there are cross-cultural differences in sort of the response curve to an epidemic or a pandemic, how much of that is due to, specific local niche environments versus actual differences in the response, in the strategies, right? I mean, in other words, this country is hot, this country is cooler, therefore it causes the virus to behave differently in these 2 local niches, versus Italy had a different strategy of how they responded to this versus us. So how much of these cross-cultural variances are due to local niches versus human differences in the strategies in responding to these pandemics?
Right, so I think it's a lot of different variables. I mean, in Germany, that people look up to Angela Merkel as what she is, the leader of the free world. They trust her. I think when she said, look, we need to shelter in place for now, but here's what we're looking at. Here's what we need to watch for. And if we get to this level, then we know we can go back to work. So she provides them with a reasonable sense of hope and what to look for. So that's just as distinct from our president who says, well, it's going to be April 12th. We're all going to be in Easter. We're all going to be celebrating in church. No, it's April 30th. You have the governor of Virginia say June the 12th, and all the states seem to be handling it differently because although we have a national disaster right now, a federal national tragedy, it's handled as if it's a state-to-state tragedy. That's the way it's being handled in the U.S., so therefore it's incredibly variable. But I think there are, in Italy, for example, it was more of a northern Italy phenomenon than southern Italy phenomenon because it's more sort of around Milan where the areas are more rural. I think there weren't enough ICU beds there. I do think there were people that died in Italy that may not have died in the United States. So I think there's just differences. South Korea has a population roughly 1/6 to 1/7 of our size, yet they have like a 12-fold lower death rate than we do. That's a democracy, yet still they handled this much better. They tested much earlier. They identified where the issues were. People listened to shelter in place. We're a country U.S. is a country founded on individual rights and freedoms, and we like to act like that. There was a Republican governor who said, "Look, I'm a Republican. We believe we should be able to do what we want. We should be able to assemble. We have the right to assembly." He's going on and on about their rights. And so it's just, that's our country.
Well, I also on my Psychology Today column, I wrote an article where I took a really brilliant study that had looked at the distribution of scores on individualism versus collectivism around the world. So, the US, Canada, Anglo-Saxon countries score highly on individualism. Far East cultures score high on collectivism. And they actually demonstrated that what determines whether a country becomes collectivist or individualist is in part determined by the pathogenic density in that environment. And they argue that collectivist societies are those where you have greater historical pathogenic density, because what that does is it creates a greater demarcation between us versus them. It makes it easier to implement certain rituals, collective rituals of purity. And then as I was thinking about that article, which was published quite a few years, maybe 7-8 years ago, I thought it's a perfect application to the current situation, right? Because some of the Far East societies, because they are collectivist, were able to implement certain strategies that are simply easier for everybody to accept, exactly in line with what you said about the individual freedoms of the US, where we're going to be resistant to those measures, right?
Right, and you could make the same sort of analogy to the anti-vaccine movement here. I mean, when people ask me what's the worst thing that an anti-vaccine person says, to me, it's, what do you care what I do? You're vaccinated. What that says is, first of all, it makes two incorrect assumptions. Right. One, that vaccines are 100% effective, which they're not, and two, that everyone can be vaccinated, which they can't. So the fact that what they're saying is they think it's their inalienable right to catch and transmit a potentially fatal infection, and it's not, or it shouldn't be. And it just bothers me. It's the opposite of a collectivist notion. It's I'll do what I want to do, and everybody else be damned.
Right. So maybe this is the right time to segue into some of your earlier efforts trying to combat the anti-vaxxers. I don't think it would be incorrect to state that you were probably, in terms of academics and physicians and so on, the number one sort of nemesis to the anti-vaxxers. Would that be correct? Hold your modesty. Yes. Is that true?
Yes. Right. Well, actually, I had to speak once at a meeting in Pittsburgh, and there was a guy I trained with named Gene Shapiro, who's really stood up against this sort of the Lyme crazy folks, and he's been great about it. He's published a ton of stuff. He's at Yale. So he got up at the beginning of his talk and he said, "I always come to a talk when I see that Paul Offit is speaking, because that way I know I won't be the most hated person in the room."
Well, wait a second. Have me come to a talk with you. I might beat you. And I say this not because personally I'm not a very likable and warm guy, but I do take on. You probably don't know enough about my own academic career, but I've become the bête noire of all the bullshitters in academia that spread idea pathogens: postmodernism, radical feminism, denial of biology and explaining human behavior, cultural relativism. And so I'm very much a virologist like you are, except that I deal with parasitology of the human mind. So there you go. So you may not be the most hated guy. But so let's talk about these guys. What got you sufficiently riled up? I mean, obviously, other than they're injuring truth, they're murdering truth, they're bullshitters. But other than that, what is it that caused you to say, you know what, I'm going to stand up to these guys? It doesn't matter what the consequences are on me. I'm standing up. What is it in your personhood that gave you that fortitude to do so?
Well, I mean, in part, it's that I work in a hospital where there's not a year that goes by where there's not a child who's admitted and frankly dies of a vaccine preventable disease because of a decision that the parent made. So because that parent had gotten bad information and therefore made a bad decision which put their child in harm's way. But that's not really the real reason. I think the real reason was I really don't like these people. I mean, I don't like it that they're so media savvy, that they're as politically connected as they are, as they're lawyer backed as they are, that they actually were able to get the mainstream media to be sympathetic to them. I saw them as evil. I know this sounds like an overstatement, but when you're little and you read comic books, and when I was little and I read comic books, they still have comic books, but there was the good guys, the bad guys. I mean, you saw things in black and white, and then when you get older, you start to see the gray in life. But as I got older still, I saw these people as purely evil. I couldn't stand them. And every time I was in the media, and I knew that was upsetting them, And I knew that they were really angry that I had gotten media attention, and that made me happy. It made me happy to upset them. I mean, when I would get hate mail from them, I thought, all right, I'm really getting on these people's nerves. Good.
But now when you say these people, Jenny McCarthy and that group, the committed and public anti-vaxxers, that's who these people are.
Yeah, no. So I would divide this into three categories. I think there's the vaccine hesitant parent, we'll call them that, which is to say, they see that their children are getting, vaccines to prevent 14 different diseases in the first years of life, which can mean as many as 26 inoculations during that time, as many as 5 shots at one time to prevent diseases they don't see, using biological fluids they don't understand. I mean, there's a reasonable pushback. You don't have to convince me to get my children vaccinated. I had measles, I had mumps, I had German measles, I had chickenpox. I'm of that age. But these young parents, they didn't grow up with these diseases. They don't see these diseases today. So I think it's understandable that they would be hesitant. That's fair. And so therefore we need to step back and re-explain ourselves. The second group, which consists of, near as I can tell, one person, are the true vaccine safety activists. I mean, when I came onto the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices in 1998, I was asked to be head of the polio working group. And so I wanted to move us away from the oral polio vaccine to the inactivated vaccine, because every year about 8 to 10 children would get polio from the polio vaccine. I mean, we eliminated polio from this country by the late 70s. So for 20 years, the only polio we had was caused by the polio vaccine. There were other countries that eliminated polio only using the inactivated vaccine. So I brought this man, John Salamone, whose son was paralyzed by the oral polio vaccine, onto that committee, and he became an important voice to move us to the inactivated vaccine by the year 2000. That's a real vaccine safety activist. Then there's what I would call the anti-vaccine activists. I mean, these people are just conspiracy theorists. They don't believe anything that comes out of the CDC or academia. They believe that there's just a conspiracy to sell vaccines. It's run by Big Pharma, which has the medical establishment in their pocket and the government in their pocket. And it doesn't matter what you say to them. They believe this to be true, and they will do everything they can to make anybody who stands up for the science in this, to make their life miserable. That is a joy for them.
Now, let's see if I can add this group within one of your taxonomy. So there are parents, and maybe you've already touched on this or maybe not, but here's one theory that I have. And it comes actually from an idea pathogen that I refer to in my forthcoming book, the blank slate premise of the human mind, right? The idea that we're all born with equal potentiality, with nothing in our brains, and it's only socialization, it's only the environment that then shapes our trajectory, which of course is completely wrong. Now, if I am a parent who falls in love with my beautiful child, and then at some point, almost with the temporal, closeness of I got the vaccine, and then the child developed autism, I'd much rather place it on the big evil shoulders of that MMR vaccine, because I'm basically saying that I'm accepting the idea that we are all born perfect, we're all born wonderful. You can't say that my child has something that isn't due to an external agent. If that external agent can be pointed to, then maybe we can reverse it. So in some sense, many of these parents, while of course hopelessly wrong, are we can maybe be a bit charitable to them, because we can understand the psychology of why they need to hang on to that narrative. Is that fair?
Sure. No, I think that's right. I mean, we're causal seeking organisms, right? We want to find reasons for things. And I guess with that, we feel we have some level of control over things that generally are uncontrollable. I think that's exactly right. And also the power of anecdote is just great. I mean, my wife is a private practicing pediatrician. She goes into the office on a weekend day. She's helping the nurse give vaccines. There's a 4-month-old sitting on her mother's lap on the side of the room. And while she's drawing the vaccine up into the syringe, the 4-month-old has a seizure, goes on to have a permanent seizure disorder, epilepsy, and is dead at age 5 from a chronic neurological disease. I mean, if she had given that vaccine 5 minutes earlier, that mother would have not, there's no amount of statistical data in the world that would have convinced that mother of anything other than the vaccine caused it. What do you think, I'm stupid? My child gets a vaccine, 5 minutes later has a seizure, now is dead from a neurological disorder. I'm the mother of a vaccine damaged child. I know what I saw. It's hard to convince her otherwise.
So have you ever conducted some sort of outreach efficacy program that allows you to gauge whether, notwithstanding the power of these anecdotes that you're speaking of, that you can get people who had succumbed to these cognitive biases to then understand that they had done so? Does it become impenetrable? Once you are infected with that particular cognitive bias, it's impossible to get out of it?
No, there are people who have done that. I mean, there's a group that out of Minnesota called Voices for Vaccines, and a lot of the parents in that group were at one time sort of anti-vaccine activists who have since seen that their logic was not logical. So that can happen. There was a woman named Suzanne Walter years ago whose child had Hib meningitis, which could have been prevented by a vaccine, and she had been anti-vaccine, and then she sort of became really a vigorous vaccine activist. So it can happen, but it's hard because I think, you've made the big bet. There was a child in our hospital who came in during 2009, 2010, so during the swine flu pandemic, and the mother had vaccinated her other children, but had chosen not to give them this particular vaccine for whatever reason, maybe because swine flu sounds, more evil. So the child did poorly. I mean, came into the hospital, was initially on a ventilator, then was on an oscillator, then was on ECMO, meaning a heart-lung machine, for weeks. And he lived, but he definitely was left with residual neurological disorders. And afterwards, gently, I remember saying to her, if you were advising parents now about vaccines, what would you tell them? And she said, well, I still wouldn't get this vaccine, because I think had he gotten that vaccine, he would have done even worse.
Wow. What's happened, by the way, to the physician who, with the MMR causes autism, the guy that the paper retracted, I can't remember his name.
Andrew Wakefield.
Andrew, what's his status right now? What's going on with him?
He's been marginalized. He lost his license to practice medicine. He moved from England because he lost his license to practice medicine to the United States. Now he lives in Austin, Texas. He's a filmmaker.
Okay, so he's completely out of the medical industry.
Yeah, no, he's out of the. He still has his followers. I still think there are sycophants who will always see him as the only man willing to speak truth to power. But because he was crushed by data that showed that he was wrong, and I think that if you ask parents of children with autism today, do you think that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine caused it? And this was a recent study done by the Autism Science Foundation. 85% will say no. That wasn't true 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I think 90% would have said yes. I think the vaccine could have caused it. So data do win out at some level. With these
science is an autocorrective process, right? So let me ask you this: of the really hot, the high-profile people, the Jenny McCarthy's of the world, have any of them either publicly or privately? Well, privately, I don't know if you want to say it then, but have they come back to you and said, I was wrong, and now I'm on your side? Have you been able to flip any of those high-profile folks?
No. Because they make the big bet. They believe this to be true, and they hold that belief as one holds a religious belief, unshakably.
Well, I'm glad you said religion, because that's the next thing I want to talk about. I received yesterday an email, a private message on Facebook from someone who wanted me to actually speak about this. He didn't know that I was talking to you today, but I'll take the opportunity to discuss it now since you're here with me. His grandmother died in a Hasidic community in Israel. Precisely because, of all sorts of religious reasons, one of which is they ignore all of these things. If God wants, that's the will, blah, 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 and so on. And so he was so angry at the fact that because of their religious beliefs, this woman who apparently was 96 years old and had lived through everything that the world can throw at her was ultimately killed by, I hate to say it, the ignorance of people's belief systems. Now, you've written a book about this. Now we're applying it to a current context. How do we navigate the very difficult and sensitive topic of seemingly not infringing on people's religious rights, but also saying, hey, the science is against you, fall in line?
Yeah, the inspiration for me for that book was a woman named Rita Swan, who I had come to meet, who was, to me, the bravest person I've ever met. She grew up in the Christian Science community. She was brilliant. She went to Vanderbilt. She got a PhD in British Romantic poetry, wrote her thesis on that subject. She was smart, well-spoken, well-written, but she was a Christian Scientist. And so when her children were born, she didn't vaccinate them. And when her 15-month-old got Haemophilus influenza B type meningitis, a bacterial meningitis, she just prayed until he died. She prayed and prayed and prayed until he died. And then she sort of had her moment when she walked into the Wayne State University medical school library and started to read and realized that now this was actually before, I think this was before the Hib vaccine, but it wasn't before antibiotics. And so she could have treated her child with antibiotics and saved his life. And then she completely turned around. She became the biggest thorn in the side of the Christian Science community because she felt she'd been betrayed. But in order to do that, she had to embrace the fact that she had let her child die, which is, it's hard enough to watch your children suffer. The notion that you caused that suffering is something that is just impossible to live with, and has been extremely difficult for her to live with, for her to make that, to embrace that. And so, yet she remained religious, and which is to say, the way that I guess some people refer to religious, which is to say moral, that she wanted to lead a moral life, and that she felt that morality in some level was she was able to lead that moral life by having an interaction with God, which is fine. It's all great. So I just that was the impetus for the book for me, because what upset her the most, interestingly, was not as much that she did it; it's that she could do it, that she was allowed to do it, that no one stopped her from doing it, that the law never stepped in to stop her from doing it, from putting her child in harm's way, from not treating her child with antibiotics for bacterial meningitis. That was fine, because she said, I was expressing my religious belief. The minute you say that, everybody stands back, and it upset her that people stood back.
What is the law in the United States in terms of when these two things are pitted against each other? The right of a child to, or anybody, of this elderly person in the case of the Hasidic woman, to be free of disease, versus the right of the people who are, their caretakers, saying this is an expression of my religious belief and you can't infringe. Where does the law fall on this issue?
It generally falls in the hands of the believer. I mean, it's very hard to get a conviction for somebody who said they were expressing their religious belief. It is. I mean, faith healers still exist. Right. We have two huge faith healing centers in Philadelphia. One is Faith Tabernacle, and others First Century Gospel. Those are big faith healing communities. I don't see anybody stepping in and saying, look, you need to vaccinate your children. You need to treat your children with antibiotics for bacterial meningitis or insulin for diabetes. They just pray. And we don't like to tell people how to practice their faith. We don't like to tell people how to raise their children. And this is sort of the combination of both those things. So honestly, and I'm saying this somewhat jokingly, but when people come into our hospital, which is in Philadelphia, we also serve a relatively underserved community. There's a lot of medical neglect. There's a lot of medical neglect based on poverty. You feel like saying when somebody medically neglects their child to death, just say you prayed. Just say you prayed and you're good. Otherwise, the police are going to be at your door.
Wow. Let's get back for a few minutes on some technical issues with the virus. And again, forgive me if this line of questioning appears somewhat naive. I don't know enough about virology. What amount of the mechanisms of the different classes of viruses are similar to one another, and which ones are unique signatures? In other words, can we, for example, ever hope, even in a science fiction future world, to have one universal key that allows us to kill all viruses because we found the commonality across all of them? Or are they so uniquely different that could never happen?
That could never happen.
Why?
I think viruses will outlive us. I mean,
because they could mutate and change, and we could never keep up with them?
Flu's a perfect example. I mean, flu's a moving target. I'm on something called the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee. So every February, early March, we sit down and we try and pick the strains for next year's flu vaccine. This is a vaccine that requires a yearly. Flu vaccine has to be given yearly. Why? Because natural infection or immunization the year before doesn't protect you the following year. That's how much of a moving target it is. But I think people don't realize how much it is. I mean, you think of, for people that know the field, will say, well, there's different serotypes. There's H1N1, there's H3N2, bird flu, H5N1. But there's really all these clades and subclades and subclades. There's sort of like variants on all of them. And, we try and get it right. And generally we get it right. But we missed in 2017, 2018. And so the H3N2 strain that we picked, which was the so-called 3C2A clade, ended up being a 3C3A clade, which nobody'd seen before. And so there was a massive amount of infection that was completely uncovered by that vaccine. And I dare anybody to go back and look at the data we had to make that decision, because we're looking at what's going on in the world and how things move. And we couldn't, we just didn't pick it, and that's not that unusual.
Now, maybe I could link it to some of my own interests in evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology. So when I'm lecturing about behavioral plasticity, the fact that humans have evolved to be behaviorally having adaptive, right? I could have spices in one culture and non-spices in another as part of my cuisine, because the use of spices is actually an adaptive solution to pathogenic density in that culture. So a cultural manifestation is a solution to a biological problem. But then I link it, and I discuss this in my forthcoming book, I link it to the immune system, where adaptability is itself an adaptation, right? If the immune system had only evolved to have 0 degrees of freedom, it could only attack pathogens 1, 2, and 3. Once any of these pathogens mutate, then I'm dead if I don't have degrees of freedom. So it seems very natural for me to take these principles from evolutionary theory and apply them, say, to epidemiology. But generally speaking, in medicine, students are not trained with an understanding of evolutionary theory. And I've actually had on my show Randy Nesse, who is probably the premier guy who is trying to Darwinize, if you'd like, the medical school. So give me a sense of how much does evolutionary theory constitute a fundamental part of what you do? And if so, why hasn't it seeped its way into other medical domains?
Great question. I mean, it would be great if people like you could teach in medical school, so people could see more culturally what they were doing, or just more evolutionarily what they were doing. I mean, I do think that, for example, understanding the anti-vaccine movement is, in general, people like me, just say, okay, here's this ill-founded belief. Here's this belief which has now been thoroughly tested and shown to be incorrect. And so my attitude, which is kind of, deficit theory of just providing information that I think people don't have. And I think I completely missed the point by doing that. I do. I think that there's sort of looking at this, say, through an anthropologist's eyes or your eyes. It's how has this evolved? What does this mean? How look at this as a cultural phenomenon rather than as just people who, are willfully ignorant. I think is the wrong way to do it.
I think one of the reasons. So maybe I'll answer partly my own question, and then maybe you can, as a physician, you can tell me if you agree. I think in science, there's 2 units, epistemological units at which we can analyze something. There's what's called the proximate level, which is the how and what of a phenomenon. So much of science operates at the proximate level. Much of the Nobel Prizes that are won operate at the proximate level. The ultimate level is when you ask the Darwinian why. Why is the phenomenon of that form? So let's take an example which I always use that comes actually from medicine. So if we take pregnancy sickness, for example, if we want to study some proximate issue, we could say, how do the hormonal fluctuations of a woman affect the severity of her pregnancy sickness symptoms? It's a how question. We could look at what questions. So much of what an OBGYN person would do is focus on the proximate. Now, the ultimate question would be, why have women evolved this universal physiological response? And the answer turns out to be, do you mind if I put you on the spot and ask if you know what the answer is?
No, please tell me the answer.
Oh, well, thank you for being humble enough to say so. And actually, I get MBA students who are in many cases physicians and surgeons who then come up to me after and say, how come I didn't learn this in medical school? And so the ultimate explanation for pregnancy sickness is that it happens. I mean, you could pretty much set your watch to it. It happens in the first trimester. It happens during organogenesis, where it is uniquely important that the mother not be exposed to teratogens, things that could wreak havoc to the formation of the organs in utero. And therefore, she evolves disdain for certain foods that would have that pathogenic load. And then as an insurance policy, she throws up, right? Well, it turns out that women who suffer from greater pregnancy sickness are less likely to have miscarriages, are more likely to have a healthy trajectory. So by understanding the ultimate Darwinian explanation for pregnancy sickness, you end up with a completely different practical prescriptive solution. When the woman goes to see the OBGYN and says, hey, help me, give me some drug to stop the symptoms, evolutionarily speaking, you're doing the perfectly incorrect thing. What do you think of that?
No, that's really fascinating. I mean, I have a book coming out in April with HarperCollins called Overkill, When Modern Medicine Goes Too Far. And it goes through a number of situations in which there's abundant scientific evidence that we shouldn't be doing something, but we do it anyway.
Why? Just because we have inertia to stick to our position?
inertia. There's a financial incentive to do it. There are people who are just unknowing about new data. But so treating fever, for example. I mean, fever is adaptive. At higher temperature, our immune system works better. Giving reflux medicines, aside from the fact they don't work. I mean, there's a reason that you make stomach acid, to try and kill pathogens before they cause a variety of diseases. And finishing the antibiotic course. If you look at the data, more and more data are coming out that you don't need to finish the antibiotic course. Once you feel better for a couple of days, you can stop. And there's abundant evidence now for that. But, it all seems sort of, on its hard counterintuitive. Heart stents. Heart stents don't make a difference. I mean, it would seem it would make a difference, right? Because you have a blockage of greater than 70%. The area where the heart muscle is damaged is distal to that blockage. And so you put a heart stent in to open it up, and therefore you're going to have less pain and less disease. It's not true. They've done, placebo-controlled prospective studies where they pretend to put in a bare metal stent, or they put it in or they don't put it in, and the patient doesn't know, and the person who's evaluating doesn't know. And they do all the right medical things, right? Keep the blood pressure down, keep the bad cholesterol down, et cetera. No difference. And the reason is because all the other little arteries that come off that big artery, they also are blocked. And you're not opening them up either. So that's why it doesn't work. Doesn't matter. So, but it's so counterintuitive to people, that especially don't finish the antibiotic course. You feel like you've just told people, not to pray to God. It's just a look of horror on people's face, including doctors.
Wow. So and I understand you're not a cardiologist, and I know that physicians don't like to speak about other areas that they're not specialists in, but let me take a shot and you tell me if you feel comfortable talking about it. So where are we now in terms of our cumulative knowledge, and where do we fall on the use of statins? Is it useless? Is it valuable? What's the story?
So I think it is useful. I mean, I think that if it was up to cardiologists, statins would be in the water supply. But so I think there are probably more targeted ways to do it. But no, I think it's generally it's always a statistical game. So here it is. Your LDL level is this. Your very low LDL. There's LDL. Then there's VLDL, and then there's HDL. And
what's VDL? I don't know the V one. I know HDL and LDL.
Then there's very low density lipoprotein.
Oh, I see.
There's a much denser form. It's actually more dangerous. And then there's the good high density lipoprotein. So they sort of plot you on a graph to show you sort of where you are. And then you can see that you have a 13 in 100 chance of going on to develop a problem. So, which isn't 100%. So, and then because statins have side effects, fatigue and muscle weakness, et cetera, maybe you would be willing to take the chance. My general feeling is never go to a doctor, because they never give you anything that makes you feel good about yourself. So just forget it.
Well, in clinical, in psychological clinical work, say a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist, it turns out that the number one best predictor of how well your therapy would go in terms of some characteristic of the therapist, it's not whether they obtained their PhD at Harvard or their MD at Harvard Medical School or how many degrees they have, is if they exhibit the one quality called empathy. So if you have a very empathetic person, now that empathetic person could be my mom, could be my wife, could be my best friend, I might actually get more benefit from the talk therapy with this quote untrained person than a person who has all of the right degrees and all the right pedigrees, but they're not empathetic. They don't have good listening skills and so on. So in a sense, that's what you're saying.
And I think that's where alternative healers find their niche often. I mean, you go to the doctor and, you sit in the chair, and your doctor, he or she is just looking at the computer screen while they're talking to you, because they have to, make sure they've got all the stuff in the medical record filled out, often never looking at you. And, radiological procedures now make it such that you probably never need to be touched by your doctor. And, the alternative healer, on the other hand, looks at you, spends time with you, and there is something to that. I mean, there is a physiology to placebo medicine, and I think you're right.
Is there anything to the fact that now maybe that's just part of my spectrum of germaphobe and so on, worry, borderline OCD. I despise going to see physicians. They are the devil. Not because I don't respect them, not because I don't think they do, but it sends me into a whole abyss of anxiety. I'm about to die any second. Is this a common thing, or am I in the end, sort of the outlier, or is this pretty much, I'm describing everybody?
Hey, it's why I don't go. Okay, so
but is that true? Are you being literal? You literally don't go to?
I actually never go to the doctor. I mean, I know I should. I never get checkups. I mean, even when I have problems, I'm thinking this will probably go away. I mean, I am the world's worst patient.
You heard it right here, people, on the SAAD Truth. One of the most famous physicians in the United States also despises physicians. I now have proof for my disdain. All right, let's maybe wrap it up. I'm sure you're busy. You probably get a million calls these days, so I want to be mindful of your time. Send us off into our self-isolation with some final sort of positive, hopeful messages, Dr. Offit.
Okay, I think we're coming out of this COVID-19 pandemic. I do. I think as the length of time keeps getting bigger. I really do think by the end of April we're going to be getting back to work. So that's good.
We're back to normal. We're going to the university. We're going to our jobs. We're traveling to Malta, which I booked a ticket for on the third week of June. We're doing all that.
We're all traveling to Malta. No, here's what I think it's going to be gradual. I mean, I think we'll be comfortable going to work, and then we'll maybe be comfortable going to a small restaurant, and then maybe we'll be comfortable going to a museum, and then maybe we'll be comfortable going to a sporting event. I think it'll be gradually more comfortable with the bigger and bigger crowd. But I think it's going to take time. I'm on the board of trustees of the Franklin Institute, which is a big science museum in Philadelphia, and I think they're going to suffer even long after we go back to work.
Do you think that restaurants might be sort of the industry where they'll suffer the most because my possibility of feeling the pathogenic sort of disgust reflex will be very high there because I don't want to be eating any food that someone's touched. So are they kind of doomed?
I don't know. I mean, I do think it's probably population density in an area. I mean, I guess I wouldn't feel that nervous going with my wife to a small restaurant near where we live that has maybe 8 or 10 tables and, it's all sort of fairly far apart. I guess, so I don't have that particular fear, but I guess we'll see how this plays out. I feel so sorry for people who've lost their jobs because I think there's so many industries that are just small businesses, especially, they're not going to have a business anymore.
And speaking of which, I mean, my wife always reminds us when we're sitting, we have young children, we're sitting around, and she says, you know what, at least we don't have the following worry, which is that, I'm a tenured, full professor, nothing's going to happen to me. I mean, imagine the people who are not carrying that protective belt, right? I mean, so I can still feel bored, I can still feel frustrated, and the kids might get on my nerves, but I'm not worried that I'm not going to make my mortgage payments. So these people, I mean, I can really appreciate your point about having a nuanced thinking about worrying about shutting down the economy for too long, because we are going to pay a heavy other cost if we don't open things up soon, right?
Yeah, and we can work from home. I mean, I'm getting a lot of work done at home, but I can get a lot of work done on the computer. Most people in the service industry can't do that. People in the trade industry can't do that. They have to go to work.
Right. Hey, Paul, maybe when your next book comes out, we'll have you back on so we could discuss it.
That would be great. I'd love that.
That would be fantastic. Stay on the line. It was such a pleasure to talk to you. I mean, I knew you would be a charming guy just from having read this book, but this book doesn't do nearly as much justice as to when I met you. You're really, really lovely guy. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Cheers.